This episode of the Topcast is proudly supported by Writer.
One of the things that makes us human is storytelling, right? That's one of our most fundamental traits. And to be able to tell the stories behind these pieces, what they want to say, and of the people who wrote them, as genius as they may have been, right? That doesn't take anything away from that. But I think is a great way to convey this kind of repertoire in a time where it's perhaps not as easy as it used to be to convince students to play, Beethoven or Mozart or whatever it was, without making it silly.
You're listening to The Topcast, the original podcast for growth-minded instrumental music and voice teachers since 2015, with your host, Tim Topham. Our mission at Top Music is to empower instrumental music and voice teachers to find and nurture their innate creativity so that they can teach lessons that are innovative, integrated, and inspiring, and that will have a positive lifelong impact on their students. Join us each week as we interview teachers and creators from around the world and unpack fun and exciting ideas to maximize your teaching and studio business success. I'm Tim Topham and you're listening to the Topcast from Top Music. This is the podcast for independent music and voice teachers, and it's a place where we explore the smartest, most creative and future-focused ways to run a thriving and fun music teaching studio. Today, we've got a special guest to kick off our repertoire month. July this year is all about repertoire here at Top Music. Across our blog, podcasts, magazines, you name it, we are talking all about the music that students play. And in today's interview, we're unpacking a particular type of repertoire, and it's all about Urtext editions. So these are the editions that are in really plain, brightly coloured books. Many of you will know the Writer multicoloured versions of Mozart and Beethoven and Schubert, and the Henley editions, of course, those light blue books. And today we're going to be talking about what they are, how to use them, whether all teachers should use them, what ages we should be using them with, what they are, how they're created, etc. And we're finding out all about this from a highly experienced Urtext editor, Dr Mario Aschauer. Dr Aschauer is an Austrian-born musicologist, conductor and harpsichordist renowned for his work at the intersection of music scholarship and performance. He currently serves as Associate Professor of Musicology at Sam Houston State University, where he also directs the Centre for Early Music Research and Performance. In addition to performing internationally as a specialist in historical keyboards and Austrian Baroque repertoire, Aschauer is a prolific editor of Urtext editions for publishers like Writer, including works by Beethoven, Mozart, and Schubert. He's also the founder and artistic director of the Harmonia Stellarum Houston and author of the influential book German Keyboard Treatises in the second half of the 18th century. Holding degrees from the University of Vienna and the University of Music and Performing Arts Vienna, he has also held research roles at the Austrian Academy of Sciences and Yale School of Music, with ongoing interests in performance practice, editorial process, and the compositional sketches of Anton Bruckner. Well, welcome to the show, Dr. Mario Aschauer. It's great to have you with me.
Thank you so much for having me.
I think you're the first musicologist that I've ever interviewed on this show. And apologies, if there is a musicologist out there who I have interviewed, don't be offended, please, if I've got that wrong. But can you tell everybody what this field of study is actually all about?
Wow, that's a loaded question. I guess, simplistically put, you could say that musicology is kind of the academic study of pretty much all things music. So this includes, of course, music history, but this includes also organology, so study of musical instruments, music sociology, music psychology, music anything really. Also ethnomusicology, so that's music that's non-Western, I suppose. So as a large academic field, I suppose. Yeah.
Did you say organology?
Yes.
Study of instruments, but not just the organ.
No, it's all instruments.
Right, I've never heard that word before. You've taught me a new word today. That's a win. Always like to expand my vocabulary. Yeah, we're done. That's it. Now, so I know you hold a musicology role at a university at the moment, but what other things do you do in your regular kind of week or two? Do you do any teaching? That's what I wanted to find out as well.
Well, so it's a great honor to be the first musicologist. Alas, I think I'm kind of an untypical musicologist in that I got into musicology really from performing. My first degree is actually in conducting, and then went into early music and harpsichord and that kind of stuff. And at the time, one of my teachers said, if you're really serious about this early music thing, you need to take a couple of musicology classes in Vienna. And this is how I kind of got, almost by coincidence into it. And this is anyway how I'm interested, I guess, in the field is from the perspective of the performer and using the methodologies that it provides to inform what I do. That said, yes, so I'm a tenured professor of musicology here at Sam Houston State University, just outside of Houston, Texas, where I teach mainly music history, some early music, also now some music entrepreneurship, actually, because I recently, so 4 years ago, I founded an early music specialty group here in Houston. And so since I had to learn all the things of, building an organization, a nonprofit and so on, the hard way, I thought, well, might as well teach it to my students as well. And so yeah, I do that. And I teach some keyboards. So I teach harpsichord and figured bass at Rice University here in Houston and also at my own school.
That sounds super busy. And I have to say, congratulations and kudos to you for adding that element of entrepreneurship to music education, particularly performance majors. I think it is so critical. It's, it's wonderful to be able to churn out these incredibly top performers, but if they can't actually get a gig or build their career, then what's the point?
Absolutely. And the world in that sense has changed so much, even just, in the time that we've been building our careers, right? So that and the curricula haven't really changed though in terms of what we teach. So I think also kudos to my university to actually letting me teach a class like that, and the student feedback is really great, and they they learn stuff that they hadn't thought they ever need. And they're like, wow, yeah, things cost money. You need to fundraise. You need to put yourself out there and all these things. So, and it's actually, I will say, it's one of my most fun classes to teach too.
That's very cool. And I did want to pick up on something you mentioned, which was figured bass. Now, I thought that had gone the way of, teaching about reel to reel and splicing audio cassettes and things like that for recording majors. Is that's still taught? Because surely that's not something that's used. I mean, historically, obviously, it's important, but not used today anymore, is it?
Figured bass? Oh, yeah, absolutely. In the sense of basso continuo playing, absolutely. This particular class is one for organists. So these guys are about to become, church musicians. And for that, I would say it's almost a daily thing when you play any repertoire before, I would say 1850 anyway. It's a really useful skill. Actually, I will say figured bass and a particularly more specialized version of it is called partimento, which was also the training tool for composers throughout, the entire Baroque and classical period, is now actually revived as, I guess, a kind of a mix between theoretical teaching and improvisation and music theory, but in a practical way at the keyboard.
Yeah, maybe I shouldn't write it off so quickly.
No. It's actually coming back. So
there you go. Well, look, today I wanted to explore a particular side of repertoire. We're focusing on repertoire this month at Top Music. It's a side of repertoire that many of us teach, particularly if we're teaching advanced students, but we probably don't know that much about it. I don't think I do. So I'm really excited to learn. And that's all about Urtext edition. So could you briefly explain what an Urtext edition is and maybe what it isn't?
The term Urtext is German, right? And couldn't be more loaded. In fact, I would say within academia, it's not a particularly liked term because it's so unclear what it actually is and what it isn't. I guess in everyday usage, it means it's an edition that tries to, through whatever means, come as close as possible to the will of the author or of the composer, I guess, without adding any personal additions. So ADD additions to it. The term really actually is a 19th century term and was probably first used in the context of biblical scholarship.
Like Bible translations.
Yeah, exactly. Translations, maybe even interlinearly. So like with the Hebrew on one side and the German on another side. And this would be marketed as an Urtext. So as to say, it's as close to the original as possible. And then throughout the 19th century, as we see that establishment of that, I guess, classical canon that we use today. Of course, spearheaded with Beethoven, but also other composers. But anyway, music that is now composed by people who are essentially dead, and so all that's left from them is really, a written artifact from that piece of music. There, then the question becomes more prevalent. It's like, okay, what exactly is that written artifact? What is that text, and how did it come to be? And what did the composer mean by it? And so, at first in the 19th century, we see editions that were carried out by performers of the time. Like, let's say, for example, Ignaz Moscheles made an edition of Mozart's sonatas. And yes, he was interested in what Mozart had written, but of course, first of all, the pianos had changed quite a bit in those, I guess, almost 40, 50 years that ever since Mozart had died. And also musical tastes and performance tastes had changed. And so Moscheles produced the text that had, a lot of Mozart, but also a whole bunch of Moscheles. Fingerings, of course, but of course, fingerings are never by themselves, right? They also go with articulation and slurs and pedal marks and metronome numbers and all this kind of stuff. Until then, towards the end of the 19th century, we see a growing interest of, okay, so but what is it that Mozart actually wrote without Mr. Moscheles or whoever's name, without their parts in it? And we see the advent of this so-called musical Urtext edition that first of all, at the outside tries to clean up and just gives original Mozart or original Beethoven for whatever that means. And that's exactly already also the problem, because that seems to raise more questions than it answers, really.
It's a really complex. I understand a bit more now why it is so complex. And of course, you're talking about scores that are 200 years old plus, perhaps not complete, missing bits. I've seen Beethoven scores. They are atrocious to look at. Like, they are this guy just scribbled on things. And so I can only imagine how tricky that can be. So when is using an Urtext a good or bad idea? Are there sort of pros and cons that you can associate with it?
I would say, as a starting point, it's always a good idea. That means, just using an Urtext edition by itself, I guess, is no guarantee for anything, though, right? Because there's only so much that a score itself can convey, right? An editor like myself, we may have spent a year or 2 years with a piece of music and its manuscripts and its first editions and all kinds of I guess what we call sources. And there's only so much from that experience that we can convey in the score itself, right? So I guess the moment that you're really interested what a composer actually wrote, I think that's when an Urtext edition is always a good idea. As a starting point, anyway. That may not be the only thing that you use, but as a starting point, I think it's always a good idea.
Should beginners ever use an Urtext, or is it really more for teachers who know what they're doing with advanced students, etc.?
No, I think teachers can absolutely use Urtext editions with their students, and I think they should. Now, that, however, means that a teacher would have to invest a little bit of time too, because otherwise, again, often I feel like the term Urtext is so loaded, and it's as if it were something particularly special, But I mean, it's also just the black dots on a page, right, by itself. I think what an Urtext edition really is an invitation to communicate a little bit more and a little bit more directly, perhaps, with a composer and his writing habits and his ideas of style and composition. And this is kind of like a door that maybe an Urtext edition opens a little bit wider. However, it involves, I guess, a little bit of work to actually go through the door and accept that invitation. But that said, I think, there are stories to be told behind those texts that are just as interesting to a 5-year-old than they are to a 50-year-old. So I don't think there is a divide there.
I have to say that, in working, when I started working on Bach, for example, with my teacher, it was really interesting. I would see, so she would use an edition that had editorial markings, and that for me particularly as an inexperienced teacher as well, was the great starting spot, because I could then see, okay, this is the general approach to phrasing in this, etc. But I think as I've progressed and got older and more interested in it, being able to compare an editorial with an Urtext is really interesting as well, just to see what has been added and what, therefore, again, too, what you can take away if you wanted to interpret it slightly differently.
I guess opinions are really divided on this. When I teach seminars on this topic, to graduate students, but also to music teachers, sometimes I get the feel that they feel, a naked score with nothing else on it, whereas, is the case with, for example, a composer like Bach, is almost frightening. And I guess, well, yeah, that's one way of looking at it. But to me, it's also just really exciting. That's the thrilling aspect of an Urtext edition, that in the best case scenario, it doesn't cover the crack, but it shows where the cracks are. And this is where then creativity can happen. When something has been painted over 7 times with, I remember myself when I think my first Bach inventions were in the edition by Julius Röntgen. Not sure that's a thing in Australia, but it sure was in German speaking. Where there is slurs and there is espressivo, crescendo hairpins, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it makes it very concrete. And in fact, when these are things that are much older, like let's say the editions by Carl Czerny, for example, that is fascinating, but it is Carl Czerny's interpretation, which is fascinating. But it may not be the only thing that there is to say about Bach.
And it's a great reminder too that Bach is open to interpretation. All composers, I guess, are to some extent, and depends on how.
Sorry, particularly when you play it on the modern piano, I think it's all the more, because it's just this music is not written for this type of instrument. So the questions get ever more. And in that sense, it may actually be a good thing that the text is so bare bones, because I think on the modern piano, the gaps need to be filled in a completely different manner than it would have to be filled in on harpsichord and clavichord.
So what are some common misconceptions about Urtext editions that you can debunk for us, if you can think of any?
I think one of the misconceptions is exactly that people think, it's got the right cover color and the word Urtext on it, and therefore it's something sacred.
Yeah, it's like, it's like the sun shining through the church windows.
Exactly. There's nothing to be said against, the beauty of printed music, right? That's I would totally subscribe to that. But the text it conveys is, first of all, it's not perfect. And in fact, I would argue that if it's a Urtext edition, it's probably way less perfect than any other edition, because it really shows the gaps and the cracks that a musical text for music, from the 18th and 19th centuries just has, period. Because I see a lot, we tend to approach musical texts of the past through the lens of the 20th and 21st century. So let's say the way Stravinsky notated, or the way Stockhausen notated, right? Or Mahler, where everything is the attempt is to eliminate every type of interpretation and make it as clear and as perfect as possible. But Mozart didn't think that way, and neither did Beethoven, and neither did Schubert, nor other composers like that, right? And so, just with that angle, let's say, of the ideas of Stravinsky, that there is in fact no such thing as musical interpretation. The musician is simply the executor of the musical text. If you essentially feed an Urtext edition of a Bach or a Mozart piece into that software of execution, then I don't think that has it all to do with it. It'll be awful, exactly. But that I see a lot, because the Bach score looks very bare. It's all 16th notes with nothing else, and then sometimes that's also exactly the way it sounds. And then the Urtext didn't help at all. In fact, it destroyed everything.
So have you encountered any, shocking blunders in past editions that have just made you go, oh no, that is, surely not?
I mean, first of all, I will say I do believe that our trade works with all due diligence possible. but yeah, actually, as I got into this, I had this amazing opportunity to do some projects with bandwriter that are really big names. That includes, of course, Mozart and Beethoven and Schubert. And so, when I started these projects, clearly must be easy because so many people have looked at this before. what on earth could I contribute to this, right? And I will say I'm a particularly stubborn character, and I perhaps spend a little bit more time with things than others may. In fact, more than is probably good for me too, because my eyesight is getting worse and worse for staring at Beethoven's handwriting for hours on end. But yeah, every once in a while, I do come across things that are just completely misread, and that has to do with, I think the skill set that's involved in this kind of work is underestimated, and because I see it's great. No, I mean, with the thanks to the internet, more and more pianists and teachers have the possibility to look at manuscripts online, and they're interested in this kind of stuff, right? And since it's so available, people like to dabble in this kind of stuff. But there's a lot more to this than, just looking at some awful handwriting by
poor Beethoven.
I don't know. You probably have seen this meme on Facebook. There is one that compares Mozart's handwriting and Beethoven's handwriting. And of course, Mozart's super neat and Beethoven's super terrible. And I mean, in that picture, that's not even Mozart's handwriting.
Oh, really? Good example.
So yeah, that does happen, that we just assume things that are just not there. And it's got to do with language barriers, no, because many of them wrote in German. German in the 18th century had a different type of cursive script, Kurrentschrift, which Beethoven had terrible penmanship. And so to decipher what he was writing can be very, very difficult, particularly when you're not a native speaker of German. And so, yeah, that can lead to, a great example is a lot of people don't know that there is actually, Beethoven attempted a second version of the infamous Elise 10 years after he had actually composed it. He was gathering stuff that he had lying around on his desk and on his piano because he wanted to make some money and wanted to sell bagatelles to a German publisher, and among these pieces that he was going to include was also a draft for Elise. I don't know what that says about the character of Elise that Beethoven 10 years later perhaps didn't even know who she was. So he had given the final version to Elise, whoever she was, and had kept a draft. And now he found this draft again, which of course was not really usable. So he started to revise it into a new piece. Meanwhile, he had already used this particular piece of paper also for sketches for his incidental music for Egmont, and had sketched some other things. And Beethoven liked to jot down ideas that he was thinking about in words as he was composing. And so a quite renowned Beethoven scholar who published this version first, very unfortunately misread some of the notes that Beethoven made on that piece of paper. They were actually not pertaining to Elise at all, but to Egmont. And he could decipher also wrongly one of the words and read wieder, which means again in German. And so he thought at this point there should be yet another Wiederholung, a repeat of the infamous so in his version there is yet another repeat of that at this point, very annoying. And that's really just because he had misread the sentence that Beethoven had written down, which doesn't even pertain to Elise at all, but to a different piece. So that's a good example. I mean, nonetheless, it's a great scholarly achievement to even publish that in the first place, right? But as I'm saying, hey, it just happens that you stumble across something where at the end, you have to guess, and then, you may guess wrong.
And is there a composer whose notation or manuscripts have been especially misinterpreted over the years, in your opinion?
I think it's particularly prone to happen when there is a lot of manuscripts about something, because another aspect that I think is underappreciated in this is an understanding of a composer's process. It's not at all like the famous Amadeus movie likes to portray, that the composer sits at the piano and all of a sudden inspirations, and all he has to do now is, commit this finished piece to paper. That was already not true for Mozart at all. Unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of sketches that survive, but we do have some that show that also he was, a working musician.
There you go. I actually thought Mozart was that prodigious. He literally, because there's that story, isn't there, of him listening to that sacred choral piece that wasn't written down anywhere. Is that a true story? Do you know? And he went, do you know the story
No,
I mean?
none of that is true. Actually, I do a popular lecture debunking the Amadeus movie because you'd actually not believe what's true and what's not true. Because those things, particularly with the manuscripts and his composing process, is definitely not true. And it's actually a story that stems from the 19th century thanks to a forged letter where that process was described. Now, I will say Mozart was extremely well trained by his father and made it a habit to write as correctly as he could, because it is also true that Mozart was a little bit of a procrastinator and often composed stuff, particularly when it was accompanied with orchestra, in the very last moment. So that means, you have no rehearsal time. You better write that score as legible as possible, because otherwise they'll embarrass you at the concert when you play your stuff, right? So that makes sense, right? But he was definitely also a worker. He definitely also corrected, maybe not as much as some other composers, but Salieri, by the way, told the story that he killed Mozart in a mental institution. That part is true. Yes.
He was murdered?
No, Salieri did, at the end of his life, end up in a mental institution and is supposed to have claimed that he killed Mozart. So that part at the beginning, at the end of the movie, that actually is historical, yeah.
The other thing I love telling students about Mozart is because it's really easy to interpret him in a very pretty, precise, fun kind of way. Am I right? Is it true? Because I've always said this to my students. He was into pretty dirty jokes and he was a bit of a comedian, like a fun guy. Like he wasn't all that, because I think we see him as really strict and set and all that kind of stuff. Is it true? Have I got that right?
Well, I mean, that's kind of hard to say, right, from a 21st century lens. But I mean, it's definitely true. We have examples of him, using very dirty language. I mean, his mom, I was born, only 100 miles from where Mozart was born. And his mom was an extremely hardy woman with with an appropriately hardy sense of humor. And so I think he definitely was a fun person in the best sense. I mean, he had access to the highest circles in Vienna. He is supposed to have been a splendid dancer, definitely an incredibly creative mind. So he was definitely not a Hanswurst, as we would say, like a clown, as in portrayed in the movie that he did, because he would have, they would have thrown him out everywhere, right?
Right, okay. What you've just heard is the beginning of the composition Paper Aeroplane by Jacob Metelka. This flowing, charming piece is part of the collection Little Virtuoso and offers a fine example of Metelka's compositional style, imaginative and witty, with appealing melodies and unusual colourful harmonies. Contemporary yet highly accessible, it is pedagogically valuable, it's music with real substance. The pieces are wonderfully suited to advanced beginners. So you can discover this album and other titles by Metelka in the Baronreiter web stores, for example at www.baronreiter.us. That's BARENREITER. There you'll also find the complete Baronreiter Urtext catalogue, including the new edition of Fanny Hensel's Easter Sonata. Go and check it out. So it wasn't to that extent.
Not to that extent, but he was definitely, a person that people would have enjoyed to be around. Not least because he was also an amazing musician. On the other hand, though, I mean, when you think about, operas like Don Giovanni, that definitely, or, some of the, think the D minor piano concerto or the second movement in the Genami concerto in C minor. And that guy was not just, fun and beans, but there's also incredible depth to his personality. So I think he was an incredibly deep character, but also fun. Yeah, a bit of both. Yeah.
So you mentioned before, Mario, about how deep you go, how long it takes you when you are working. And I know you've been working with our sponsor for this series, Writer. What drew you to take on this task of actually creating these Urtext editions? Because it's a bit of a labor of love, I think, isn't it? You must be really passionate.
It's because the way I got to this is just because I, as a performer, wanted to come as closely as possible to the musical artwork, right? And that is, in our musical culture, is a written musical culture. So it will, for a big part, go via the route of written artifacts, and definitely of the written score, right? And that was just always fascinating to me, how exactly they write things. Because, let's face it, right? When one of the cool parts of this job is that you do get to go to libraries, and they will show you the originals, and you do get to sit, and hang out with Mozart for a few hours, and look at that paper that he touched and that he wrote on, and that he maybe struggled with or had fun writing this. Yeah, that is really, really cool. There is no anecdotes, and there is no stories and jokes and I don't know whatnot. No, this is where like the hard facts happen. Getting acquainted with that, with all the skills that takes, learning how to read this kind of stuff, learning how to categorize it, I guess. In the case of Beethoven, there's various types of manuscripts, right? So you have to familiarize yourself. How did Beethoven even work? Like, how did he go about it? Because it's, as I'm saying, not like, oh, I'm just sitting down on a Monday morning and I'm going to write the symphony and I'm going to be done by Friday evening.
And I'll write it out start to finish and I'll get it all perfect. Yeah.
But it actually involves several different manuscripts in which, this evolving, I guess, of the music happens. And so to understand, when you look at a page of a manuscript like this, like, what am I even looking at here? Is this a final version? Is this, like, what purpose did this manuscript have? In the process is really important. And to then transfer this into your performance, I just always thought was the coolest thing. And that's how, anyway, I work as a performer.
It really is almost a forensic task, isn't it? Like you're a detective trying to get to the bottom of a challenge and see what's actually there.
Absolutely. And that's part of what I like about it, is that part of the detective work, kind of figuring out, okay, this manuscript, what was the point of it even? How did this come together? Here he corrected something, or, someone else wrote something. And how did this come to be? There's definitely, I've spent many a night over a passage that is like, what does this even mean? And then figuring it out does make me feel I get a little closer to the composer. And it's still genius, and I have no idea how he did it, right? But I have a little bit more of an idea how it came to be and what happened to this. And in many cases, it's a little bit like figuring out a magic trick. In these cases, however, it does not detract from the magic trick at all. It actually makes it even more impressive, because there's, even on the backside, there's magic, if you will.
And what if there's no original remaining? Does that ever happen where you're asked to create an Urtext, but there's only, the next level, like the student's written it out or something? I don't know.
That happens all the time.
So how do you handle that? Or you just have to sort of see all of those editions and work out what you think was probably what was originally intended? It's
really a case by case how you decide to deal with that. That's a little bit more complicated, of course. And I guess there is different ways to do that. So there's less of a standard procedure. I personally like more figuring out what the pieces of the puzzle are and presenting them as such, and then leaving, maybe even making a suggestion of how I would complete the puzzle, but making that really clear that that's merely a suggestion. Because I actually think that really, if you're going to play that piece of a performer, you kind of should care enough to figure out the puzzle pieces yourself, at least a little bit. I mean, you can also play my version, right? My edition of Für Elise is an example for that, no? Because I mean, that second version that he was working on is unfinished, so it's only sketched out, right? And so, and this is where I have a lot of respect for Bandwriter as a publisher, right? Because they're perhaps even the only, big market publisher that has, a really, worldwide reach that will allow me craziness like that. Namely, they contracted me for the Beethoven year to do a new edition of Für Elise, and I thought, well,
what could you possibly add to Für Elise?
Exactly. And like, how long is that going to take me? Like half an hour? I don't know. There's literally only one source for that, because that's actually one of those cases where there's no Beethoven manuscript of it, at least of the version that we know. But it was only published in a collection of letters, actually, and the manuscripts have since disappeared. So really, you could say, I mean, the easiest case from an editorial perspective, right? And then I started digging. I figured this out with Beethoven wanting to reuse it for other bagatelles and blah, blah, blah. And so then I said, hey, guys, I have this amazing idea. I want to actually print 3 versions of the thing, the well-known version, an actual transcription of that absolutely crazy piece of manuscript of his draft that he was reworking, with a million of footnotes so that you could go, so it's like, well, I can't read any of this. But with the help of my transcription, which is really, it's diplomatic. So it's like, the lines and where the notes are on the page are the same as in the manuscript. So you can put those, it's almost like a map to the manuscript, and you can go back and say, what did he write here? And then you can, then you can see my, I guess, disentanglement of this. But that ends up in, you can't play it either, because of course, when something's crossed out, I also crossed it out. You can still see, but it's just to make clear where stuff is. So then I said, and then so thirdly, I want to make a suggestion of how to actually play this. And so a project like this came from 4 pages, became 16 pages. And there is not, I will say, there are not a lot of publishers in the world of this rank that will do that, simply because, who's gonna, read this?
How widely useful is it? Yeah,
exactly. But now this is the fun part, though. As it turns out, we've received a lot of amazing feedback from all kinds of people all over the world. It's not like people are not interested in that. I think it's just like so often, it's a question of how you present it and how accessible you make it. And then it's like, and I did a YouTube video with that version as well. And people are like, oh my God, this is mind blowing. I had no idea this even existed. And this is so cool. And this is where musicology, editorial work, and performance kind of, come together and are really, really fun.
I'm going to check out that video. Well, I'll find it and put a link with our notes for today. That sounds really, really interesting. I do find it fascinating. And I think you've taught me today that 2 of the key elements of creating these editions and doing it well is knowing, obviously, the history, when it was, what they were doing in their life, where they were, what they were thinking. And I've always found this really interesting when I've done my own research for music that I've played, but also how they write. Knowing their writing process is obviously fairly critical. And my goodness, there can't be that many people in the world who have a deep understanding of these things. It's super, super specialized. So I really do appreciate you sharing it.
It gets even more interesting when you look at it from a comparative perspective, from, let's say, composers that lived around the same time or had, similar teachers or wrote similar music, that you see that, yeah, they had very similar working habits and write in a particular way. And what I find particularly fascinating is that they're all incredibly creative people, and they don't really adhere to the Urtext idea at all. There's so many inconsistencies or stuff that just really is not quite perfect in the way they write it, right? Like Schubert, who will, clearly write reprises in sonata form from memory. And so the second time around, it's just going to be ever so slightly different. There's no copy-paste mentality at all. And I just find that fascinating, because it draws our focus to, it's like, what is it that is important to them in an interpretation and what's really not even a thing. Like, for example, to play the exact same way the second time around. And those are things that I think we can learn from this kind of work. And that certainly I have learned and has inspired what I do as a performer.
What are some of the other works that you've helped create for Bärenreiter, for example, in the Urtext area?
So in the piano area, I've done a new edition of the Mozart A Major Sonata, the one with the Alla Turca, because at the time, a new autograph or a part of the original autograph reappeared all of a sudden. And then yet another manuscript of that sonata that led to quite a bit more knowledge about also, Mozart, not so much his working habits, but also how to treat the contemporary printed editions, right? Because for Mozart, that's a little bit of a problem because often first editions deviate from what he wrote in the autographs. And there's quite a few opinions out there why that is and what it means. And those newly discovered manuscripts, I think, have shed some new light on that. Something that I had already kind of anticipated had then been confirmed.
Really? Wow, yeah. That's cool. Yeah.
And that has led to me, and yet another, completely crazy project. In that edition, you'll see that I edited the text twice, once according to the autograph, once according to the first edition, because I just don't think there is a way to say, what's the final will here. There's at least no facts that could argue one way or another. So let's just keep it separate and leave it to the performer to also, look back and forth and say, okay, so, this changed and why would that have changed? And, is it intentional or has it just happened? And also there, at first, some folks at Bärenreiter were like, I don't know, anyone's gonna enjoy using that. And also there, we got emails from pianists all over the world that said, oh my God, I had no idea. Thank you for even bringing that up. I didn't know because, obviously, when there's even a preface or a critical commentary at the end, it's like buried in lists that are indecipherable. And the pianist wants to play piano, not read, like little tables with abbreviations and stuff like that, right? And so I guess I'm trying to convey it as clearly as I can in musical text. So that was one. The next one was the Diabelli variations, plus the 50 variations on Diabelli's waltz that Viennese composers wrote that actually gave the idea for Beethoven, because originally this was a project by Diabelli, who was an incredibly clever businessman and started out a business and thought, how can I have everybody with a name in my catalog within a couple of years? And so I thought, well, I'm going to just send a waltz that I composed to everybody, like the who is who of composers in Vienna, and ask them to contribute one variation.
I had no idea. That's clever. That's a really clever marketing.
Extremely clever. And he also sent it to Beethoven, and Beethoven didn't want to participate in that. And says, well, obviously I'm better than everybody else. So I won't write one, but I'll actually write 33. and again, Diabelli, was a clever businessman and says, yes, great. I'll take both.
Still got my name on it. Yeah.
Exactly. And so there's actually two parts to this project now. With Beethoven's set being one and the 50 variations by the other composers, including Schubert, by example, and Czerny and
I don't think I've ever seen that collection. I've only been familiar with Beethoven's Diabelli.
Yeah, it is now available in a great Bärenreiter edition edited by me. So by the way, it's also really great teaching material because the variations are in difficulty really from very simple, almost unplayably difficult. In length from 32 measures to 300 something measures. Also, there is a YouTube video of me playing the longest Diabelli variation by a Viennese composer by the name of Förster. That's over 300 measures long. That's an old, on the rather silly waltz. But anyway, so that was the project. And then more recently, the Bagatelles. So there's a new edition of the Bagatelles that really puts all the pieces with all new scholarship that I have been able to find new things about these pieces. That's also great teaching material, I think, particularly because, so there's, I mentioned this earlier in the context of Für Elise, that Beethoven was thinking about a new set of bagatelles that he wanted to sell. Long story short, the publisher rejected those pieces. He totally figured that this is just trash that's lying around in his, and wrote him a long letter saying, I'm buying this, but I will not publish it because people will not believe that this is by Beethoven. So those pieces have never been published as a collection, and so I'm suggesting an order for them. And they're also, a little bit unfinished, a little bit, so it's great material to improvise a little bit, to, make sense of it, to add things, to detract things, to arrange things. So really, I think a treasure trove for teaching and performance creativity. So I think that's a really cool edition. I'm working on a new edition of the complete Mozart sonatas.
Wow, my goodness. There's 30 or so, isn't there? How do you? Oh, my goodness. Amazing. Look, thank you so much, Mario, for giving us an insight as to what goes into this, because I think it's really easy as a teacher. You pull out an edition, it's probably your favorite, it might be the one your teacher taught you with, and that's your favorite one still. And then we'll sometimes grab an Urtext, and just to think of what goes into actually putting this together, it's quite extraordinary, and it has given me a really new appreciation for the work that people like you do and the amount of experience and all your years of experience that goes into these things. So thank you for the work that you do as well. I thought we might just finish with just a quick tip or two that you might have for teachers working with Urtext editions with their students. Can you think of anything that comes to mind?
If I do a shameless plug, because, in a way, when in my editions anyway, and you'll see there's a lot of text that accompanies them, I am thinking about the teachers and, it's not just like a documentation kind of project, but I am thinking about also in my everyday work about how does this change people's lives anyway? So, and I'm trying to convey the stories behind these pieces that sometimes are actually kind of funny, like the one that I just told you about Beethoven actually pretty much at the peak of his career being rejected by a very reputable German publisher. It's just like, no, this shit, I can't. I'm sorry, I can't publish this possibly. That. And Beethoven also wrote a very loaded letter back. So and it just makes, without making music and these composers and this piece of musical culture, without making it trashy or taking anything away from its value, it also shows a human side. And personally, I also as a teacher, I think one of the things that makes us human is storytelling, right? That's one of our most fundamental traits. And to be able to tell the stories behind these pieces, what they want to say, and of the people who wrote them, as genius as they may have been, right? That doesn't take anything away from that. But I think is a great way to convey this kind of repertoire in a time where it's perhaps not as easy as it used to be to convince students to play, Beethoven or Mozart or whatever it was, without making it silly, but making it meaningful and finding stories that, perhaps they can also attach to and latch onto.
I've really enjoyed the stories today. I think we almost need to get you back on the show just to talk through some fun stories of composers that you've never known about. You must have so many. It's so much fun to know about those.
I think there is, because way too often it happens that people just keep retelling anecdotes that are silly and it's just distracts from the art, right? But then I feel like there's stories that are just as good. They're actually true, that don't ruin the thing for you. For example, Salieri was a very sick man at the end of his life and had to be in a sanatorium. And yes, but and when you then look at his very last pieces, where you can tell in his handwriting he had a very strong tremor. You see the handwriting of a very old, very sick man, and then you read these original documents, claiming that yes, he said that, he was so out of it already that he said that. Just makes them ever so slightly more human. and almost three-dimensional. No, that again, it makes it meaningful without taking away from. Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic music. That's because sometimes I feel like those anecdotes, they kind of make it seem like Don Giovanni is just a silly little piece, and that's just not true.
Yeah, I really encourage teachers to do what, and I know it takes time, but to do what they can to find these stories and relay them and explore them with students, because it really does personalize. And I think the more I learned about Rachmaninoff, for example, I studied one of his elegy in E flat minor when I was doing my diploma, and I worked out that he wrote this at 19, this incredibly deep, passionate, moving piece at 19. And I think of, what 19-year-olds are doing these days. And, it's like, I don't know, it just brings a different element to your own playing, or knowing what Beethoven was personally going through. He wrote the sonata you're performing, or whatever it is. I think that it's really helpful.
Sometimes it's also remarkable that we know it was one of the best moments of his life. And then he writes the E minor sonata, the Mozart, for example, no? The other thing, by the way, that I, of course, as an early music person, always encourage is dipping into the sound world of these pieces, right? Because none of this music is written for the modern big black piano. Because I'm actually getting a new piano, a forte piano, that's a copy of Mozart's instrument. Yeah, I can show you right here. Here's a hammer of a piano from Mozart's time.
Oh my goodness! It looks like it's a long stick with looks like the tail of a like eighth note at the bottom. At the other end, the hammer's cylindrical. It looks like a ring.
Yes, it is a ring. It's essentially a piece of wood tube, and it's hollow. And as you can see, it has nothing on it. So this is the actual hammer.
Wasn't felted.
There was no felt, no leather, no nothing. There's a quite famous letter by Mozart where he is in Augsburg, the hometown of his father, right? And visiting the piano maker Johann Andreas Stein and writing this long letter about how he loves this piano and it's just an amazing instrument. And can we buy one? Father, of course, says no, it's way too expensive. And this was the type of hammer that Stein was in Augsburg at the time experimenting with. But just a few years before, hammers become solid and have leather covering and changes, of course, the sound. But neither and the box, the strings, everything else didn't change at all. It was really, this was one of the development points. But anyway, neither of these hammers and actions sound anything like the modern piano, right? Now, I'm not saying that you should recreate this on the modern piano. I think that's also kind of a silly approach. But I think, in order to get into this, and particularly for students, with my students anyway, I see that a lot, when we also talk about different temperaments, different tunings, different, that this is something that they can actually get into. Some details about, music history may not be that important to them, or may, feel kind of distant. But to actually hear something that's a sound world that's new to them and also kind of exotic, I guess, that can really attract them. And I'm making the same experience with audiences with my group too. When there's something to experience that is new, that is literally unheard of, I think is definitely something that can attract audiences that are otherwise never exposed to this kind of stuff. Really to listen in new ways to pieces that are long in our repertoire and that mean a great deal to us. And it's like a key, again, a door through which to access it.
Well, look, I think we better wrap things up there, Mario. It's been wonderful to talk with you. I could talk for a lot more over a glass of wine sometime when I'm next over in the States, I think. We've learned a lot by listening to you. Thank you so much again. You better tell everyone where they can find out more about you and also your Houston group as well.
Yes, my Houston group is called Harmonia Stellarum, so the harmony of the stars. In Houston, you can find us. You just Google our name, you'll find our website, and we also have a pretty nice YouTube channel where you'll also find some videos of me doing essentially what I did with you just now, trying to explain some interesting, meaningful stories about the repertoire that we perform, the background information, and many of them actually shot at historical locations, so like the church where something was
cool.
for the first time performed. And there's definitely a whole bunch of fun stuff also coming for the new season. Other than that, just Google my name. You'll find my website. Check out my projects in Bärenreiter's catalog, or search me on Spotify for some more recordings. In this day and age, just my name alone, I think, will get you to a whole bunch of perhaps fun stuff.
We'll share some links on our show notes for today's episode, which is at topmusic.co/episode 422. Mario, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks again for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed today's interview with Mario Aschauer, and I hope you do check out the Bärenreiter Urtext editions, as Bärenreiter is proudly sponsoring this month of repertoire focus on the podcast. You can find all the links and notes over at our show notes for today's episode at topmusic.co/episode 422. Well, that's the end of the show for this week. Next week on the podcast, we are connecting with Dr. Merlin Thompson, a Canadian teacher, author, and presenter, and we are talking all about curriculum models and approaches to teaching, right from the start, right through the intermediate period, right up to advanced students, and how we actually structure that balance between when we're kind of in charge and directing things and when students are in charge and choosing and directing things and choosing music to what they want to play. How do we balance that? Why should we balance that? Is there balance? We're going to be unpacking all of that. It's all about curriculum models. We'll be catching you this time next week. I'm Tim Topham, and you've been listening to the Topcast. I'll speak to you really soon. How do you keep up to date with all the latest trends and research into music education? How do you connect with other teachers around the world and make sure your teaching stays fresh and relevant for students of all ages and stages, both now and into the future? I created our Top Music Pro membership to be the one-stop shop for music teaching resources, training, support, and community, and I'd love for you to come and join us inside. With over 40 comprehensive training courses, hundreds of teaching demonstrations and lesson plans, free monthly sheet music, discounts, and all the business and pedagogy support you could ever need, Top Music Pro is the community you've been looking for. If you're ready to level up your learning from the podcast and join thousands of other teachers in our global network, head over to topmusicpro.com today. If you enjoy this show and want to hear more of our work, be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening today. For links and resources mentioned in this episode, visit us at topmusic.co/podcast or check out the show notes. I'm Tim Topham. Thank you so much for listening. Enjoy your week ahead, and I'll catch you next time.